Conference realignment is far from over, and rumors are that the Big 12 wants to go from 16 up to 18 and is considering Gonzaga and UConn among some others. Could Mark Few's team actually be Big 12 bound after all?
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Welcome to the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. These days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. That's why LinkedIn Jobs helps find the right people for your team faster and for free. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That is linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. Terms and conditions apply. Well, folks, we're going to talk some Big 12 today. We're also going to hear from a familiar voice, at least for many of you who listened to the Gimme Timme podcast. We're going to do that in the second segment. And we're going to close out the show with discussion about a reported transfer portal target that the Zags are interested in. That is Memphis center Malcolm Dandridge. All that coming up today on Locked On Zags, but we got a lead talking conference realignment. And more specifically, continuing to talk about Gonzaga and the Big 12, because rumors have swirled and they've gone up and they have gone down. And it has seemed like Gonzaga to the Big 12 was inevitable. It has seemed like Gonzaga to the Big 12 is very, very far away. And we have kind of just been all over the place with regards to where Gonzaga fits in the now seemingly never-ending conference realignment saga in college athletics. What we know now, of course, the obvious breakdown, the Pac-12 has effectively disintegrated. It is now the Pac-4 with Stanford, Cal, Oregon State, and Washington State. As I'm recording this, there continue to be rumors that those schools are involved with the Big 12. There are now rumors that the ACC is potentially vetting adding at least Stanford and Cal, which would be a very unique conference to exist. The Big 10 hasn't fully ruled out Stanford and Cal after already adding USC, UCLA, Oregon, and Washington. So there's a lot that's happening on that front. Of course, the Big 12 went from losing Texas and Oklahoma to gaining Houston, Cincinnati, BYU, and Central Florida, to then also adding the four corner schools out of the Pac-12. That would be Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and Arizona State. Big 10 is at 18 schools. If they get to 20, it will be because they add somebody like Stanford or Cal, or if they can try to convince Florida State or Clemson to leave the ACC, they might get up to 20 that way. But Gonzaga is not really in the Big 10 conversation. Gonzaga is not in the SEC conversation. The SEC doesn't seem to be doing a ton right now. They're kind of just waiting for Texas and Oklahoma and holding firm with where they're at. ACC doesn't make sense for Gonzaga. We'll talk a lot more about the Big East on future episodes because I think there is absolutely something that could exist there. But for right now, the conversation surrounding Gonzaga and conference realignment primarily involves the Big 12 and whatever comes out of this Pac-12 Mountain West potential American Conference merger that may or may not happen. It was speculated on an episode I did last week. It's been speculated by many other people outside of me as well. But for right now, Gonzaga seems to still be in those conversations around the Big 12. Latest reports are that the Big 12 wants to get from 16 to 18, that there are 7 schools they are considering. 4 of them are the Pac-4, Stanford, Cal, Oregon State, Washington State. UConn is in that conversation as well. San Diego State is in that conversation as well, the 2 teams that played each other in the national championship game this last year. And of course, Gonzaga makes 7. The rumors that I saw as well also indicated that the Big 12 is potentially looking at Gonzaga or UConn as basketball-only members. Now, we've seen this a few times, and I've never found it particularly realistic. If the Big 12 wants Gonzaga, the Big 12 is going to be taking all of Gonzaga. They're going to be taking the baseball. They're going to be taking the soccer. They're going to be taking all of the sports that Gonzaga has that the Big 12 also offers. There is the possibility that some of the schools that Gonzaga has are schools that the Big 12 doesn't offer, in which case Gonzaga would find another place to potentially house those programs. That's something that is fairly common around. I mean, the WCC offers softball, for example, but Gonzaga, of course, does not have a softball program. There are various other sports that fit into that. San Diego has a football team, for example, going forward. But for Gonzaga, I don't see why Gonzaga would take their basketball programs, because basketball only does imply men's and women's basketball. I don't see why they would take their basketball programs, put them in the Big 12. And what would happen after that? I don't see a realistic path. I've said this many times on this podcast. Those of you who are everyday listeners know what I am about to say, but I don't see why the WCC would keep the rest of Gonzaga's athletics while losing the basketball programs. What incentive does the WCC have to do that? It just doesn't make sense to me. And I really don't see Gonzaga's athletic department going to the other programs and saying, hey, we're going to house soccer and volleyball and baseball and tennis and whomever else in the Big Sky or the Big West or the WAC or whomever is willing to take those sports. And we're going to take our best sport, our biggest moneymaker, by a tremendous margin, the biggest moneymaker in the WCC by, again, huge amounts. And we're going to take that to the Big 12. Cool. I just don't think that's going to happen. So the question then becomes, if the Big 12 is willing to accept all of Gonzaga's sports, what does that look like financially? And is the piece of the puzzle or the piece of the pie that Gonzaga is going to get from the Big 12, we know it's going to be more than they're making from the WCC, because it's just really hard to imagine that it would be less. But is it going to be enough of a bump financially to offset the cost of travel for your teams? Not just your basketball team, but traveling your soccer team to Morgantown, West Virginia. Are you going to be able to do that? Then, of course, you have to weigh the cons of, the things that we've seen many student athletes talking about in light of this Pac-12, dissolution that we saw of, like, I didn't sign up to go to a Pac-12 school to play Rutgers and Maryland, and we're seeing that from Olympic sports. Football and basketball aren't necessarily in those conversations, but college athletics is about more than football and basketball. And I have a hard time seeing a reality where Gonzaga says, well, we're only going to have our basketballs be there and we're going to keep the rest of our student athletes here. I'm just not sure that that's going to work. Does that mean that Gonzaga to the Big 12 isn't going to work? Of course not. I think there are absolutely avenues to this being successful. It's just not as simple as the Big 12 owners get together, they vote, they say, we'll accept Gonzaga. Gonzaga says, yep, we're in and we're moving forward. It's not going to be that simple, because Gonzaga doesn't have the football team, because the financials are going to be significantly different, because the travel piece is very dramatically different for a school like Gonzaga. It's just a more complicated situation. Having said that, my gosh, Gonzaga in the Big 12 would be so fun. Look at what the Big 12 is right now. I mean, just here's a list of the schools. I mean, just looking down, it's really hard to not want to be in this conference. You have obvious, already pre-existing West Coast-ish rivalries in Arizona and BYU. They're already there. They're already built in. There's already a history. There's already camaraderie. There's already fan bases at each other's throats. It already exists with two of the programs in the Big 12. Then you have Baylor. Kind of already exists there too. Gonzaga and Baylor have played each other a handful of times in the non-conference. They, of course, played in the national championship game a few years ago. Scott Drew and Mark Few are two of the best who are doing it right now. Like, that's already a matchup that has some intrigue. Playing Baylor every year a couple of times would be incredible. Then you have Kansas, Houston, West Virginia, Texas Tech, just these programs that have been premier successful basketball programs for the last couple of decades. Kansas and Houston are kind of a step above where Texas Tech and West Virginia are at lately, but those are still quality premier programs that Gonzaga would get to face. You have TCU. Gonzaga just faced them in the NCAA tournament. You have Iowa State, a program that has consistently been very good the last couple of years. Kansas State just took a huge jump last year with Coach Jerome Tang. Then you have the three other schools coming from the Pac-12, Colorado, Arizona State, and Utah. Less of an actual basketball competition there. Arizona State was a tournament team last year, but only barely. But there's a lot of Zags in Denver who would probably love to get a chance to see Gonzaga play in a non-conference game in their home area, in Denver, Boulder area. That would be huge for them to get to go watch the Zags play Colorado. Same with Utah. Of course, they get BYU and Utah now. So any Zags living in the Salt Lake City, Provo, anywhere in Utah are going to have a really fun opportunity to get a chance to see the Zags. And then you have Cincinnati, Oklahoma State, and Central Florida, the other schools rounding it out. Again, quality programs that are certainly a higher level of basketball than what the bottom of the WCC currently is. So that's kind of where I'm at with this. I would love the Big 12. I mean, who wouldn't love the Big 12? The fact that Gonzaga is still being considered when the Big 12 is already up to 16 is proof that Brett Yormark, the commissioner, really does love college basketball and really does want to make the Big 12 the premier college basketball brand in the sport. It already is, if we're being honest, especially after adding Arizona and Houston. I mean, it is the best basketball conference, with no disrespect to the Big East, but or even the SEC. Big 12 is the best, and adding Gonzaga and UConn or San Diego State or whatever combination of these programs they bring in is going to continue to help solidify that. I think it'd be great if Gonzaga could get in. I think there's some very obvious intrigue, some very obvious rivalries that could form out of that, but there's a lot of hurdles that would still need to be overcome in order to make that work. Well, we're going to hear from Gimme Timme podcast host Noah Buono regarding his thoughts on Gonzaga and the Big 12 Conference. All of that coming up after a word from today's sponsor, LinkedIn Jobs. These days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. You want to be 100% certain that you have access to the best qualified candidates available, and that's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs, because LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the right people for your team faster and for free. It is so easy to create a free job post, and then all you have to do is add your job and the purple hashtag hiring frame to your LinkedIn profile to spread the word that you're hiring. From there, simple tools like screening questions make it easy to prioritize who you'd like to interview and hire. And let's be honest, the right team member can have a positive and measurable impact on your business. This is why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus the leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. So post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That is linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Folks, want to thank all of you for making Locked On Zags your first listen or your first watch of the day. Shout out to those everyday listeners checking the show out on YouTube. Very much appreciated there. We got more conference realignment conversation coming later this week, and this episode will continue to keep you updated what's going on with the Big 12. Whether the Big East might get involved, we'll have some more interviews and other various fun things going on this week as well. But for now, we're going to hear from Noah Buono, a guy that many of you have heard from as listeners of the Gimme Timme podcast. Of course, the great podcast with Drew Timme, part of iHeartRadio, that went out last year throughout the college basketball season. Noah came on the Locked On College Basketball podcast. Him and I spoke about a variety of different topics, including how Gonzaga might fare in the Big 12. Noah had some very, very stern thoughts on Gonzaga in the Big 12, and we're going to hear from all of those right after this. Before we get into that, I do want to talk a little bit, stay on this conference realignment conversation and kind of just talk about Gonzaga's fit here, because UConn would have to make the decision to leave a conference that's very, very good, that, I mean, didn't hurt them at all in their quest to make the NCAA tournament championship last year, and that they have this rich history with. Gonzaga obviously has a history in the WCC, but no one's going to have any debate about how much better the Big 12 conference would be. And this is coming from somebody who loves the WCC. I truly do. But I mean, this isn't even close. And if Gonzaga has the opportunity, there's a lot of people out there who are going to say, oh, this program would collapse. There's no way they would be able to win. And like, look, they're not going to go 37-1 like they did in 2017. They're not going to go undefeated like they did in 2021 with Jalen Suggs. But the idea, at least to me, that Gonzaga wouldn't be able to hang in the Big 12 feels kind of frivolous. Again, they're going to lose more games, but it feels to me like they'd still be pretty competitive. Is that from getting to watch them a little bit last year and talk with Drew, do you feel like this is a team that could make that jump if they needed to?
WCC is less competitive than the Big 12 would be. That's you're not saying anything. When people say that, it's obvious. No, like no shit.
Yeah.
And like, of course they're not going to go 37-1. Of course they're not going to be as dominant as they would be in the WCC, but that doesn't mean they're going to go to the Big 12 and stink.
Right.
I think that if they went to the Big 12, there's a legitimate 0% chance that they stunk, that they were a bottom tier team. I think it's completely asinine, makes no sense that it can even, like, that's just to me like when people just hate on a program. It's like, oh, I hate Gonzaga. So like they would suck if they went to the Big 12. They would suck if they were. No, they wouldn't. No, they wouldn't, because their culture, their coach, their whole vibe and demeanor as a program is as high level as you need it to be. It's in the realm of like the Warriors, the Yankees, the Lakers, like, well, maybe not the current Lakers with what had been going on, but you know what I mean? Like just the culture of that environment, like the Patriots, they're not a losing team. They're not losers over there. So I don't think like you could plug them into any conference and they're going to figure out a way to finish in the top half of the conference. So I always just, every time I hear it, I'm like, we're not speaking logically if we say that this powerhouse basketball school is going to have any trouble winning elsewhere. Sure, they're going to lose more games, but it ain't going to depict that like, oh, they're actually a dog shit program. No. They're solidified as a bona fide, amazing, historic college basketball program, and they always will be.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's what it's so striking to me that people make comments like, well, what happens if Mark Few leaves? It's like, yeah, like that's the program's going to change, but the culture is there. It's not like he is 100% of it. He's not even close to 100% of it. And I know people were worried when Tommy Lloyd left. He'd been there for 20 years and was really a big catalyst for their international recruiting and a lot of their success. And anybody in the program would tell you, yeah, losing Tommy hurt, but like the idea that Tommy going to Arizona means that when Mark Few leaves, Gonzaga is just going to become like every other school in the WCC is tremendous to me. I can't believe that people are genuinely afraid of that. Like Gonzaga has built a brand that is going to outlast their current coach, and he deserves so much credit for building and maintaining that brand, but it is not solely him. And to me, getting this team into another conference and getting them, to start being able to recruit without having you're in the WCC attached to them, they're going to recruit even better and they're going to get better. And to me, like them joining a new conference isn't going to hurt them. It's going to hurt their Mark Few's overall win-loss record, but he's going to be totally fine with that.
But again, who cares? You're going to lose games. It don't matter.
Yeah, 100%. Well, no, I want to talk about Drew Timme because whenever given the opportunity, I like to talk about Drew Timme because he was such a fun character to follow for 4 years at Gonzaga, a tremendous career. And last year, he started to launch his media career, something that seems fairly possible will be in the cards for him after his basketball playing career is over, which will hopefully be a long time from now. But you got the opportunity to host that Gimme Timme podcast. And I'd kind of love to hear from you just how it kind of came together for you and Drew, your kind of opportunities to meet each other and kind of get familiar as you started this podcast together and kind of just what that experience was like for you getting a chance to work with Drew.
Excuse me. Sorry. Oh man, the Gimme Timme podcast was absolute blessing. And it was honestly like some of the most fun that I've had. And I've only been out of college for a year and a half now, but like since being out of college and even during my last couple of years at Duquesne, like that, because I had a lot of different regimented routines, whether it was like being on the Duquesne team and everything that comes with that on a day-to-day basis, or then starting to work out of college and, doing player development and doing that every day. Like then I started doing the Gimme Timme podcast and that became like very regimented and, cemented in my everyday routine because like it was my job. And, I was attached to this big name like Drew Timme. It was his last year. And I kind of just wore it with a lot of pride of like, it's on me to help make this guy's brand look even better and to showcase him as like, like you said, opening up his media career and him as a media talent and like all these different components that came along with it. And so like, I absorbed it as though it was a full-time job. Because that's just in my nature, and I just wanted to do right by him, by his agents, by his family, and ultimately, for myself as well. In my own kickstart for my career, I thought it was a great opportunity. And it was honestly random how it came about because I was a walk-on at both of the division schools I went to, and my walk-on journey was like not as fun as maybe a Michigan State walk-on's journey or Coach K's grandson at Duke, where they're just it's maybe peaches and rainbows for them. Mine was a little bit the opposite. And so when NIL passed in 2021, I had a fifth year because of all the transferring I did. And I decided, like, I always wanted to podcast. And so I started a show called Walkie Talkies Podcast. And it was centered around just interviewing current and former walk-ons of any sport, of any era. And it got to the point where like I was hustling so much to teach myself it, but also to get guests on. I was doing every layer by myself.
Right.
And I ended up getting Rudy Rudiger from the, infamous Notre Dame football movie, Rudy. I got Andre Drummond on the show. I interviewed Brad Calipari, Coach Calson when he was a walk-on at Kentucky. So I was just hustling because I cared a lot about like other people's walk-on stories, and I thought it was a really good idea, to put on a platform.
Mm-hmm.
And then I ended up getting a deal with like a new podcast network that was attached to iHeartRadio.
Mm-hmm.
And I wouldn't say I got so good at it, but I got really experienced because I was putting out episodes every single week. I was super consistent. I cared about it a lot. Like I wasn't gonna, I want to start a podcast and I put out 2 episodes and you never hear from me again. I wasn't gonna be that guy. Like I truly wanted to do it.
Mm-hmm.
So fast forward, and I'm putting out episodes weekly last summer with Walkie Talkies, and the network and iHeart was trying to get a deal with Drew and some bigger name college athletes. They ended up getting Drew and the Cavender twins, but how it came about for me was like they needed someone to host it and produce it, and they had no one. But it was kind of like his agents, who I love now, have a great relationship with both of them, which has been great. But at the time, we're like, well, we'll have a phone call with like who you think your potential host and producer could be for Drew, and if Drew likes him, then maybe we'll like move forward. So then it became like, oh wow, like if this happens, this is only going to happen if Drew likes me. Like if I have a good impression on Drew on this like random phone call on a Tuesday morning, whenever Drew calls me, and I knew the call was coming. It was like Tuesday at 1 p.m. Like expect Drew Timme to call you, and I was like, well, okay, that's so weird, but okay. And so we just got on the phone, and it was it was if I've known him for 10 years. Because he's a bro, and I'm it just was easy, and we're very similar, and obviously that carried on into the show. And so from that initial phone call, it just became on my shoulders to like fully sell him on like, hey, I think this is something you really should do. And my biggest pitch was like, buddy, I'm going to make it as easy as possible, as easy as possible for you. You ain't going to have to do shit. I'll do everything. Just get your ass on the call once a week, 2-3 hours. We'll go through it before we record. We'll record, and then we'll get you the hell out of here. And then it just became a point where that was our rhythm, but we just became friends out of it. Like we would sit on the Zoom call, for 3 hours after recording, like eating pizza, drinking, just chilling. Like because we were just that was our week to hang out, kick it. And it was great because like I didn't at that point, as that became the rhythm, I didn't really care about the podcast. So I was just like, oh, it's the whole time my goal was like, well, hopefully we just become friends, man. Like, the podcast is fun. And then we became friends. I went to Spokane back-to-back weekends for that St. Mary's game, and the, college game day came out. And then I went back there like a week and a half later, and we recorded a live podcast at the casino out there, which was great. So like it was just like a big, one step at a time to kind of like sell them on the thing, then get the podcast rolling, and ultimately do a good job on it. And I mean, I don't really love talking myself up, but I do think me and Drew did a kick-ass job on that thing. And it was so much fun.
All right. Thanks to Noah for coming on the Locked On College Basketball podcast. Glad we got a chance to hear from him. But now Gonzaga is reportedly involved in another transfer portal target. And this time it's a big man. We've seen them involved heavily in the guard market, but they are looking at Memphis center Malcolm Dandridge. We're going to talk about that right after this. All right, folks, final segment here. Still Andy Patton, still locked on Zags. Switching away from our conversations about the Big 12 Conference to focus on yet another transfer portal target for Mark Few and the Gonzaga Bulldogs. They have 2 scholarships remaining after adding Marcus Adams Jr. to replace the departed Alex Tui. Primarily so far in the last couple months, really, of the offseason, the Zags have been looking at a guard, primarily to replace Malachi Smith as the expectation, a third guard behind Ryan Nembhard and Nolan Hickman, somebody who's going to compete with minutes for Dusty Stromer, potentially compete with minutes for Steele Venters, assuming that Steele plays some minutes at the 2 if Junsock Yo or Marcus Adams Jr. are playing more minutes at the 3. However, the latest player that is connected to Gonzaga in the transfer portal is Malcolm Dandridge. Malcolm Dandridge is a 6'9" center out of Memphis. It was tweeted by John Rothstein about a week ago that Gonzaga has made some contact with Dandridge. And the fit is a tiny bit odd, but we can explain maybe why we think Mark Few and the staff might be involved here. And also, all we know is that there has been some contact made between these two sides. Hard to always know how serious that actually means anybody would be in this situation. Dandridge is a graduate transfer. He spent the last 4 years all at Memphis. He is from Memphis. That is who he is and where he is from. He spent 4 years again under Penny Hardaway with the Tigers. Numbers never really jumped off the page. In 4 years, he averaged about 13 minutes per game. So he's always kind of been a backup center. I think he started 14 out of 101 games that he's played with Memphis. Averaged about 4.2 points per game, 3 rebounds, 0.8 blocks per game. Again, that's in just under 13 minutes of action. So what's the rub here? What's kind of the perception for Gonzaga? We're looking at a team that already kind of has a lot of 6'9" big men. I mean, that's the first thing that jumped out to me. Graham Ike is listed at 6'9". Anton Watson is listed at 6'8". Ben Gregg is listed at 6'9". Caden Perry is listed at 6'9". Braden Huff, I think, is listed at 6'10", perhaps. But regardless, Gonzaga has a roster full of undersized bigs. So somebody like Malcolm Dandridge, who is an undersized big, feels a bit like an odd fit. When Gonzaga was pursuing Naheem McLeod, who was out of Florida State, who ultimately ended up going to Syracuse, McLeod is 7'1". When Gonzaga was pursuing Jesse Edwards, who was out of Syracuse, who went to West Virginia, Edwards was, I think, is 7'2", 7'1". He's over 7 feet. Those kind of additions made sense because Gonzaga needed rim protection. They still do. It is, in my mind, the biggest area of concern on this team in terms of roster building, roster construction. Who is going to protect the rim? Now, Dandridge may be 6'9", and it may feel like that makes him not a great fit for this role, but his numbers have shown that he is a solid rim protector in the limited role that he has had. 0.8 blocks per game in about 13 minutes, pretty good. His blocks per 40 have come out to be about 2.5 blocks per game. Is he going to come into Gonzaga, play 25 minutes a night and block 1.5 to 2 shots per game? No, of course not. I don't think that's the reality here, the likelihood. But what I do think is that Gonzaga is identifying a player who could fill a role as a third or fourth big for the Zags. Do they need a third or fourth big, especially more than they need a third guard? I would argue probably not, but it's hard to ignore the fact that 2 of the players expected to play roles in Gonzaga's front court next year have a pretty lengthy injury history. Graham Ike missed all of last year with a foot injury. He missed an entire season. When he was healthy the year before that, he was incredible for Wyoming, 19.5 points per game, 9.5 boards per game. He was excellent. Caden Perry hasn't played in 2 years. He's played 8 games since he got to Gonzaga as a freshman a couple of years ago. So depending on him to play a significant role next year would be foolish. All accounts right now are that he's healthy. I have expected that Caden Perry will be somebody who finds himself on the court at times next season, but I don't think Gonzaga is expecting him to play a consistent every single day role. And the fact that they're pursuing somebody like Dandridge, or at least making the call, kind of indicates that they do feel like they could add more to that front court and it wouldn't be detrimental to their team. Having somebody like Dandridge, who doesn't need the ball in his hands, who isn't a high-level scorer, who's a decent rebounder, but who on the defensive end of the floor can use his body, use his size to prevent other players from getting easy shots around the rim. If that's all he does, if he plays 8 minutes a game, commits 3 or 4 fouls, but blocks a few shots or at least prevents a few guys from getting good looks at the hoop, there's nothing wrong with that. He's a grad transfer coming in for 1 year. He's not going to slow the development of guys like Huff or guys like Perry or Gregg or anybody like that. He's not going to take playing time from Ben Gregg or Watson or even Ike, assuming that he is healthy. So I can see the fit. I can see the appeal. It's not exactly what I think Gonzaga needs more than anything else. But if they don't feel like the guards that are out there are players that they need, they watched Jeremiah Williams, they were targeting, go to Rutgers. Like there's some guys out there who they were interested in, but who have committed elsewhere. Maybe they feel like, hey, we have 2 roster spots. We're not seeing anybody who fits a need here, but maybe there's a guy that we can get who fits another need, who can do something else for the program. And that's kind of where I feel like this is coming in. We're going to talk on a future episode of the show about some more players who just became available. There's 2 transfers who just showed up. Both have ties to the WCC. Both could be appealing to Gonzaga. We'll talk about that on a future episode of Locked On Zags. But for right now, I think the Zags are just expanding their options to look at, hey, maybe it doesn't have to be a 6'5" combo guard who plays good defense. Like, we're at the point where we have these open spots. Let's find out who we can add to this team who's going to make us better, even if it's not the exact player that we need. That's kind of the impression I've got. Dandridge has gotten interest from St. Louis. He's gotten interest from Michigan. He's gotten some interest from West Virginia and Memphis. Penny Hardaway spoke just a couple of days ago and said he feels that there is a good chance that Dandridge will return to Memphis. So he could come back to school if he wanted to. It's easy to see the fit at West Virginia. They lose Mo Wagee. They lose James Okonkwo. They lose Trey Mitchell. All three of those guys hit the portal after Bob Huggins loses his job. St. Louis, he would get a lot more playing time there. Really solid A-10 program that lost their best player in Yuri Collins last year, but still has a lot of upside in that program. Michigan, I'm not sure if the need is still there necessarily, but certainly he could play a smaller role at Michigan like he's done at Memphis and like he would do at Gonzaga as well. So a player to keep an eye on, a guy that I don't think is super likely to commit to Gonzaga necessarily, but certainly always worth reporting when we see Gonzaga connecting with prospects or transfers, especially here in late August. All right, folks, that's going to do it for me today. Don't forget to check out the Locked On College Basketball podcast, especially if you want to hear more of that conversation we had with Noah Buono. More fantastic stuff there. More fantastic stuff coming your way here on Locked On Zags as well. We'll talk Big East. We'll talk some more conference realignment. We'll have some fun guests on to get into August and September, these slow seasons, which haven't been that slow so far here on Locked On Zags. Again, thank you so much for listening. Until next time, as always, go Zags.